Shut up, freak. The words hit me harder than the cold Puget Sound wind. Big Sal, the dockmaster, stood over me, his face a mask of pure contempt, his barrel chest puffed out like he owned the entire Seattle waterfront. His crew snickered behind him, and the tourist waiting to board the ferry shot me glances of pity and confusion. The hot, prickling feeling of shame crawled up my neck. They only saw a broken man scribbling in a sketchbook. They didn't feel it. They couldn't feel the low, dissonant shudder traveling up from the pier, a wrong vibration from the ferry's hull that screamed of disaster. I had tried to warn them, and for that, I was dismissed. The ferry's horn blared, a final note in my public humiliation. But nobody imagined what I would do that day. If this sentence made you remember someone, just comment with an "I understand." My name is Marcus, and I'm 39 years old. But to the men who work the Seattle waterfront, my age doesn't matter. My name doesn't matter. To them, I am simply the freak. My world is this splintered wooden bench on Pier 57. It's my office, my sanctuary, and my stage for daily humiliation. From here, I can see everything. The great wheel turning in a slow, hypnotic circle, the gulls crying like hungry ghosts, and the ferries, the magnificent steel beasts that are the only things that have ever made sense to me. I don't work the docks. I don't haul lines or guide forklifts. I draw. In my worn sketchbook, I capture the souls of these vessels, the precise curve of a hull, the geometry of a superstructure, the way a ship sits in the water. It's a language I speak fluently, a silent conversation between me and the steel. This world, the world of noise and rough men, is not mine. I'm just an observer, a ghost they have to step around. The king of this world is a man they call Big Sal. He's the dockmaster, built like a shipping container with a temper to match. He has a face weathered by sea salt and cheap cigars, and eyes that see me as nothing more than a piece of driftwood cluttering his pier. To Sal and his crew, my quiet focus isn't a skill. It's a sickness. My passion for the ships isn't a calling, it's proof that I'm broken. They see my worn jacket, my second-hand boots, the way I avoid eye contact, and they see weakness. They see a target. I remember one day last spring, the sky was that rare, brilliant blue. I was capturing the lines of a cargo ship, the Pacific Rose, when Sal and his crew walked by. He stopped right in front of me, blocking my view. "Still drawing your little pictures, freak?" he boomed, his voice echoing across the pier. Tourists turned to look. I just stared at my page, my pencil frozen. "You know," he continued, a cruel grin spreading across his face, "my kid's 5. He draws boats, too. Maybe you two could compare notes." His crew erupted in laughter, that deep rumbling sound that always makes my insides feel cold and hollow. I didn't say anything. I just waited for them to move on, the heat of shame burning my ears. That's how it always is. A casual jab, a public dismissal, a reminder that I don't belong in their world of practical, calloused hands. Another time, he kicked a bucket of grimy water accidentally near my bench, the splash soaking the bottom of my sketchbook. "Watch it," he grunted, not at me, but at the puddle, as if it were the thing out of place. The pages warped as they dried, a permanent wrinkled scar on my drawings. Each laugh, each sneer, was another layer on the wall of isolation I lived behind. It's a strange kind of pain. It's not sharp, like a cut. It's a dull, constant ache of being seen but never understood. So I retreat deeper into my work, into the predictable comfort of lines and angles, where everything has a purpose and a place. Then came that Tuesday. The sky was the color of worn steel, a typical Seattle gray. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and fried fish. It was just another day of existing on the fringe. I was on my bench, my 2H pencil tracing the proud, sweeping lines of the Puget Star, a 3-deck tourist ferry getting ready for its midday run. I knew this ship intimately. I'd drawn her 100 times. I knew the rhythm of her engines, the specific groan her gangway made as passengers boarded. But as the last of the tourists shuffled on, something new cut through the familiar symphony of the pier. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was a feeling. A low, dissonant shudder that traveled through the wooden planks of the pier, up through the soles of my boots and into the bones of my legs. It was wrong. It was a vibration that didn't belong to the deep, steady thrum of the main engines. It was a high-frequency tremor, thin and sharp, like a guitar string stretched to its breaking point. My head snapped up. No one else seemed to notice. The crew was busy casting off lines. The tourists were waving to people on the shore. Sal was barking orders. But I couldn't ignore it. My eyes darted to the hull of the ferry, to the exact spot just above the waterline that my pencil had been shading. And I could almost see it, a faint, frantic shimmer on the steel plates. A harmonic dissonance, a flaw, a scream that only I could hear. For the first time in years, the fear of disaster became greater than my fear of people. My carefully constructed wall of silence crumbled. I stood up so fast my sketchbook tumbled to the ground, pages fluttering in the wind. I ran towards the gangway, waving my hands, my heart hammering against my ribs. The words were a tangled knot in my throat. I grabbed the arm of a young deckhand. "The boat," I stammered, my voice tight and unfamiliar. It's shaking wrong." The deckhand just looked at me with annoyance and pulled his arm away. But Sal saw me. He stormed over, his face a thundercloud. "What did I tell you about bothering my crew, you freak?" he growled, his voice low and menacing. I ignored the insult, the panic giving me a strange sort of courage. "The hull," I insisted, pointing with a trembling finger. "There's a bad vibration. Below the waterline. It's not right." Sal gave the ferry a cursory glance and then turned his glare back to me. His eyes filled with a disgust so pure it felt like a physical blow. He stepped closer so his shadow fell over me, and he said the words loud enough for the departing tourists and his entire crew to hear. "Shut up, freak." He turned his back on me, a final, absolute dismissal. "Get this thing out of here," he yelled to the captain. The ferry's horn blared, a mournful sound that echoed my own defeat. I retreated to my bench, the shame and terror a toxic cocktail in my gut, as I watched the Puget Star pull away from the safety of the pier. If you've ever felt this way, just leave a in the comments. We get it. My hands were shaking. I tried to press them against the splintered wood of the bench to anchor myself, but the tremor was deep inside me, a seismic event of shame and terror. The ferry's horn faded, leaving behind the normal sounds of the pier, the cry of the gulls, the distant hum of traffic. But everything sounded muted, distorted, like I was hearing it from underwater. I couldn't move. I just sat there, a statue of humiliation, watching the Puget Star grow smaller as it churned a white wake in the gray water. Every part of me wanted to run, to disappear back into the anonymity of the city, to hide from the lingering stares of the tourists and the smirks of Sal's crew. But I couldn't. An invisible tether of dread held me in place, my eyes locked on the vessel. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, each beat a silent scream. I was right. I know I was right. The wind picked up, cold and sharp, smelling of salt and wet decay. It whipped a loose page of my sketchbook back and forth, a frantic, rhythmic slapping against the worn cover. My pencil had rolled under the bench. I didn't even try to reach for it. My world had shrunk to that single point of light on the water, the white ferry moving steadily towards the deeper channel. 200 yards. That's how far it got. Then, it happened. It wasn't a sudden explosion, not a dramatic crash. It was something more insidious, more sickening. A subtle, unnatural lurch. The boat tilted to port just a few degrees, but it was a dead, heavy list, not the gentle roll of a vessel on the waves. It was the movement of something broken. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd still lingering on the pier. People lowered their phones, their smiles vanishing. On the ferry's deck, I could see the tiny figures of passengers stumbling, grabbing for railings. The low, dissonant hum I had felt in my bones was now a sound. a high-pitched, groaning shriek of stressed metal that carried across the water, a sound of pure agony. And then I saw it, a dark, greedy wound opening in the hull, exactly where I had pointed. Water, the cold, dark water of the Sound, wasn't just seeping in, it was pouring in, a visible torrent violating the clean white steel. Panic erupted on the dock. It was instantaneous, a flash fire of chaos. People were shouting, pointing. Sal, who had been laughing with his crew just moments before, stood frozen for a second, his face a mask of disbelief that quickly curdled into sheer terror. The color drained from his weathered cheeks, leaving him a ghastly shade of gray. "Mayday, mayday!" he roared into his radio, his voice cracking. "Puget Star is taking on water. Hull breach on the port side." His crew, the men who had laughed at me, were now a whirlwind of useless motion, running back and forth, shouting at each other, their training and experience dissolving in the face of a real disaster. The boat was losing stability fast, the list growing more severe with every passing second. In minutes, it would capsize and sink into the deep channel, taking everyone with it. And in that moment of pure, screaming terror, my mind went silent. The noise of the pier, the shouts, the sirens starting to wail in the distance, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. The shaking in my hands stopped. The hot shame was gone, replaced by an icy, absolute clarity. All my hours, all my days, all my years spent on this bench weren't just about drawing. They were about understanding. I had absorbed this harbor. I knew its every secret. The currents that swirled around the new pilings, the depth charts I'd memorized from old maritime maps, the forgotten ghosts of the waterfront that lay just beneath the surface. My mind projected a perfect map over the churning gray water, a three-dimensional image of the seabed below. I saw the deep channel, a dark trench of no return. But I also saw something else, a ghost, a relic. The rotting stumps of the old cannery pier, torn down decades ago, in a shallow basin of silt and sand, only 12 feet deep. It was their only chance, a lifetime of silence, of making myself small, of swallowing words, fought against the desperate need to speak. My throat was tight, my lungs burning, but the image of the sinking ship was stronger than my fear. I stood up, my legs feeling strangely steady. I took a deep breath, pulling in the cold, salty air, and I screamed. "The old pilings!" My voice was a raw, tearing sound I didn't recognize as my own. It cut through the panic like a blade. Everyone froze. The chaos stopped. Every single person on that pier, the tourists, the crew, the terrified families, turned and stared at me, at the freak. Big Sal whipped around, his eyes wide with shock, his radio held halfway to his mouth. He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't see a nuisance. He saw something else. I pointed, my arm straight and steady, my finger an arrow of certainty. "Steer for the old cannery pilings," I yelled, my voice gaining strength. "It's only 12 feet deep there. You can ground her before she goes down." For a single agonizing heartbeat, the world held its breath. Sal just stared at me, his mind racing, the scorn he'd felt his whole life warring with the raw desperation of the moment. He looked from my face to my pointing finger, and then out to the dying ferry. He saw the absolute, unshakable certainty in my eyes. The arrogance drained from his face, leaving only the terrified, responsible man underneath. He made his choice. He turned back to his radio, pressing the button so hard his knuckles were white, and he bellowed my words, his voice a desperate prayer. "Captain, hard to starboard. Aim for the old cannery pilings. Full power, now." The ferry, groaning like a dying beast and listing so badly its deck was half swamped with water, responded. It shuddered and slowly began to turn, its engines screaming in protest. It was a race against physics, a wounded animal crawling for the safety of the shore. It chugged toward the barely visible row of rotting wooden posts, a forgotten graveyard that was about to become a sanctuary. With a final soul-shattering crunch of metal against sand and wood, the Puget Star grounded itself. The forward motion stopped. The horrible list stabilized into a steep, permanent angle. But it was no longer sinking. That's when everything changed. And no one ever looked at me the same way again. Would you have done the same? Seriously, just answer with a yes or no, so I know you're here. The pier fell into a new kind of silence. It wasn't the quiet of an empty dock. It was a heavy, breathless quiet, thick with the aftermath of averted disaster. The groaning of the wounded ferry had stopped, replaced by the sound of lapping water against its now stationary hull and the distant approaching wail of sirens. No one was shouting anymore. The panic had evaporated, leaving behind a field of stunned, wide-eyed faces, and every single one of them, it seemed, was turned towards me. I stood there, my arm still half raised from pointing, a human lighthouse that had guided the ship to its strange, broken safety. The tourists, who had earlier shot me glances of pity, now stared with a mixture of confusion and awe. Sal's crew, the men who had made a sport of my existence, were frozen in place, their hands dangling uselessly at their sides. Their smirks were gone, wiped clean from their faces, replaced by slack-jawed disbelief. They looked at me, then at the half-submerged ferry, then back at me, as if trying to reconcile two impossible realities. In their eyes, I saw the slow, dawning realization that the freak, the ghost they stepped around, had just become the most important person on the entire waterfront. I slowly lowered my arm and retreated to the familiar safety of my bench. My legs felt weak, the adrenaline starting to recede, leaving a deep, bone-weary tremor in its wake. I sank onto the splintered wood, my hands gripping the edge to steady myself. My sketchbook lay open beside me, the page showing the precise, detailed drawing of the Puget Star. My frantic pencil shadings over the portside hull looked like a dark premonition, a prophecy sketched in graphite. The Coast Guard cutters arrived with practiced efficiency, their blue lights flashing silently across the gray water. They maneuvered alongside the crippled ferry, and the methodical work of rescue began. Life jackets were tossed, lines were secured, and passengers were helped one by one from the steeply angled deck onto the safety of the rescue boats. It was calm, orderly, a stark contrast to the screaming chaos that had erupted just minutes before, and all because of a handful of rotting wooden posts no one ever noticed. No one but me. I watched the entire operation, a silent observer once more. But everything was different. I was no longer on the outside looking in. I was the center, the quiet fulcrum around which this entire event had turned. The dock workers, led by Sal, moved to assist the Coast Guard, catching lines, helping shaken passengers onto the pier, but they moved with a new awareness. Every so often, one of them would glance over at me, a quick, furtive look, as if checking to see if I was still there. The air around my bench, usually charged with their casual contempt, was now a bubble of charged, respectful silence. They gave me a wide berth, not out of avoidance, but out of something that felt like reverence. The space wasn't an insult anymore. It was an honor. When the last passenger was safe on the dock, wrapped in a blanket with a cup of hot coffee, and the reporters had been cordoned off, the pier began to empty. But Sal didn't leave. He stood for a long time, staring out at the wounded ferry, now looking like a beached whale, its pride broken. He spoke into his radio, his voice low and professional, but the confident bark was gone. He looked smaller somehow, defeated. Finally, he turned and walked towards me. Not with a swagger, but with the slow, heavy steps of a man carrying an immense weight. His crew watched from a distance, a silent chorus witnessing their leader's penance. He stopped a few feet from my bench, his shadow falling not over me, but beside me. He didn't speak for a full minute. He just looked down at his own worn boots. Then his gaze drifted to my open sketchbook. He saw the drawing. He saw the dark, frantic lines I had made over the exact spot where the hull had split open like a rotten seam. A main structural weld, he said, his voice quiet and raspy, stripped of all its bluster. That's what the captain thinks. A catastrophic failure. It would have cracked wide open in the deep channel. He paused, the implication hanging in the cold air between us. They'd all be gone. Every single one of them. He finally lifted his head and looked at me. His eyes, which had always held a universe of scorn, were now clear. There was no pity. There was no anger. There was something I had never seen before directed at me from another person. Raw, unvarnished awe. It was unnerving. "You felt it," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an admission of a reality he couldn't comprehend. Through the wood, through 100 feet of water and steel, you felt it. I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "We heard you," he continued, his voice cracking slightly. We didn't listen." He cleared his throat, a rough, painful sound. He looked me straight in the eye, a man humbled before the very person he had tried so hard to diminish. "Thank you." The words were simple, but they landed with the force of a tectonic shift, rearranging the entire landscape of my life. He turned without another word and walked away, rejoining his crew, who parted for him like he was walking through water. From that day forward, everything changed. The insults stopped. The jeers vanished. The world I inhabited was the same, but my place in it was irrevocably altered. They had finally seen me. If you've ever proven something to someone in silence, comment, they understood too late. The days that followed were a study in silence. The insults, the casual cruelties that had been the soundtrack to my life on the pier, were gone. It wasn't replaced by friendliness, not at first. It was replaced by a void, an awkward, self-conscious space that the men didn't know how to fill. They'd walk past my bench, the same men who used to make a show of crowding me, and they'd instinctively give it a wide berth. But now it wasn't a gesture of exclusion. It was a gesture of deference, as if my splintered bench had become a throne of some kind. They wouldn't meet my eyes, but I could feel their glances, quick and uncertain. They were relearning the map of their own world, and I was a newly discovered, unchartable landmark. About a week after the grounding of the Puget Star, I arrived at my bench just as the sun was burning the morning fog off the water. Sitting there, in the exact spot I always placed my sketchbook, was a steaming paper cup of coffee. No note, no one around, just a simple black coffee, the steam rising from it like a quiet prayer in the cold air. I knew who it was from. It was their language. Men like Sal and his crew didn't speak in apologies. They didn't have the words for it. They spoke in gestures. A shared cigarette, a helping hand with a heavy line, a cup of black coffee left on a bench. It was an offering, a truce, a confession. I sat down and held the cup, the warmth seeping into my cold hands. It was the warmest thing I had felt in years. This became a small ritual, not every day, but often enough. Sometimes it was a coffee, other times a donut left in a small paper bag. The younger crew member Kevin, who had once joked about me drawing mermaids, was the first one to actually speak to me. He stopped by my bench one afternoon, twisting the toe of his boot into the pier planks like a nervous kid. "Hey," he mumbled, not looking at me. "That new container ship, the Olympus Mons. She sits low in the water on the stern, don't she?" I looked out at the massive vessel being guided by tugs. I had been sketching it all morning. I knew its schematics by heart. "She's designed that way," I said, my voice quiet but clear. "Ballast tanks are aft heavy for stability in rough seas. It looks wrong, but it's right." He nodded slowly, processing the information. "Huh," he said. The boss was wondering. He looked at me then, a quick, direct look of genuine curiosity. "How do you know all that?" I just tapped my sketchbook. "I listen," I said. He seemed to understand. He walked away without another word, but the question had been a bridge. They no longer saw a man scribbling nonsense. They saw a man reading a language they couldn't speak. Big Sal never tried to make conversation. He didn't need to. His apology was in his eyes. Every morning, as he did his rounds, our paths would cross. Instead of the sneer or the deliberate act of ignoring me, he would stop, give me a short, sharp nod, and then continue on his way. That nod contained everything. It contained the memory of the screaming metal, the panicked faces, the cold dread of failure. It contained the thank you he had spoken when he was broken and the respect he had to build from the ground up. In his world, a nod from the dockmaster was a sign of absolute validation, and he gave it to me, the freak, every single day. I had not entered their world. They had simply, finally, acknowledged the existence of mine. I've thought a lot about what the sea teaches. It's not a gentle teacher. It doesn't care about your reputation, your strength, or how loud you can shout. It's a place of deep, silent truths. It has a memory, and it holds on to the ghosts of old piers and forgotten wrecks. It rewards those who pay attention, those who can feel the subtle shift in a current or hear the wrong note in a ship's engine. The men on the docks, they live by the sea, but they fight it. They conquer it with steel and diesel and brute force. I never tried to fight it. I just watched it. I listened to its stories, written in the lines of the hulls and the rhythm of the tides. On that day, when the noise and panic stole every man's courage, the sea needed someone who spoke its quiet language. It wasn't the loudest voice that saved those people. It was the one that had been silent the longest. My life is quiet again. I still sit on my bench. I still draw. The world sees me differently, but I haven't changed. The respect is a comfortable cloak, but it makes me wonder, was the knowledge always there? Was my value always present, just invisible to them? They look at me now and see a hero, a guardian, a strange kind of oracle for the harbor. But before that day, they saw a freak, nothing more. It leaves me with a question that echoes in the quiet moments, a ghost that sits with me on the bench. Do they truly see me for who I am? Or do they only respect me now because for one terrifying moment, their lives depended on the one thing they could never understand? Read this ending and comment with one word that summarizes you when they doubted you.